Hello and welcome to the Godot community. I am Jody Ann Henry and I'm the Middle School Theater PLC moderator. For today's webinar, I will be sharing with you some lessons and exercises to teach in a movement unit, specifically focusing on pantomime. So, the big question that I ask my students when going into a pantomime unit is how can we tell a story when we are not speaking? How does communicating a story using only movement help enhance the performance? A lot of young actors, they're either focused on just learning the lines and reciting the lines in a performance, but they're not used to using their instrument, using their body and their voice and their imagination in order to create these three-dimensional characters on stage and really communicate the story that has been told in the scene or the play in general. So this is a really good question to get them thinking and to teach them how to use that particular instrument when communicating and telling a story, and how does that enhance the performance. So we look at different forms of nonverbal communication, which is eye contact, it's facial expression, our use of gestures, tempo and rhythm of our movement, proximity, how close, how far, how we use the space, and how we can create those interesting stage pictures that communicate so much about the story, as well as physical contact. We then define pantomime and mime and look at the differences and the similarities. So, what exactly is pantomime? What exactly is mime? Well, pantomime is the use of imaginary situations and objects to create a story. The artist usually works with imaginary objects, and the focus or the main goal for a pantomime performance is to focus on recognizable actions as opposed to showing themes. So the performance is based on completing an action and doing it in a very realistic way, versus mime, which is the silent art of using body movements to create an illusion of reality. They interact with imaginary objects, and sometimes they may use parts of their body to become the object or to express certain ideas. It is a very abstract and stylized form of performance. In these performances, they use at least five basic facial expressions, which are usually very exaggerated. And those are those emotions the character may go through is happy, sad, surprised, angry, and afraid. And they use really big facial expressions and movements and gestures to convey meaning. The main goal of a mime performance is to express an idea. It is not to perform realistic tasks or perform the actions in an exact way. It is more to give you an idea in order to tell the story. So why study pantomime? Well, it is the first phase of acting. We have three main tools that we use as our instrument in telling stories and performing on stage. And those are your body, voice, and your imagination. Language of action is universal. The actions speak louder than words. And I oftentimes try to get my students to realize that even if we are watching something in a different language, we get a gist of what's going, we get a gist of how the character is feeling, how the story is developing by what we see. We're not always listening, but we can definitely pick up cues by what we see. So being able to use that part of your instrument is really, really important. So what are those principles of a pantomime? A relaxed body is key. So I oftentimes start off this lesson or starting off this unit for each class is going through some type of relaxation exercise, some type of physical stretching and warm up, making sure that students are centered and they're present. Another thing is the use of posture and movements is expected of your character. So warming up your body again is important, not just for relaxation, but preparing, and it also improves your posture and allows for more fluid movement and ease throughout the performance or the exercise. Other principles: positive emotions equal high, expanded, free, broad, animated gestures. Negative emotions equal tense, contracted, restricted gestures. Avoid covering your face when expressing emotion. Direct the story to the audience, and all movements should be clearly motivated. So these are some key principles I remind my students of when working through a pantomime performance or exercise, or just as we're exploring the unit. The techniques of pantomime are based on what human beings do physically in response to emotional stimulation other than people and the objects around them. When creating an object in a pantomime, it is important to visualize the object, see it in your mind, approach the object, move towards it, take the object, make contact with it. And I teach my students the click method. Tell the audience its location, so establish the size and the shape and the weight of the object, and you can do that in terms of how you respond or your reaction to it. So if I want to establish the location, I'm going to make eye contact, so I'm looking at it. I will then hold on to that object, so I'm establishing the shape. The tension in my arm will tell you the weight of my object, and then I can release by using click and letting it go. So those are some ways, and we oftentimes start off by just establishing maybe a mug we're holding. We may do the wall, placing the hand, the fingers need to be closed, release, release. Now, some do's and don'ts of pantomime. Do exaggerate your facial expressions. And a lot of my younger actors that are a little more self-conscious are afraid of how, they're more so talked about how they look when they're making these big facial expressions. But the story is not communicated, the emotion is not communicated if we're not really giving those big facial expressions. Do show the shape, size, and weight of objects, especially when we're dealing with imaginary objects. It's important that we're establishing that and being consistent when we are using those imaginary objects within the story in the space. Focus on completing the task, so not suggesting that I'm eating breakfast or suggesting that I'm picking up a cup, but fully focus on the task. Do show the audience who you are, where you are, and what is happening. And you can do that through your interaction with the imaginary objects and within the situation that you've created. Make sure you plan a beginning, middle, and end, so there needs to be a complete story. And do include some type of conflict or problem that the character has to work through and overcome. And make sure that you're taking your time, you're not rushing. Again, you're completing an exact task, you're completing recognizable actions. So they need to be very specific, and they should not be a suggestion of what you're doing. Some don'ts. Don't mouth words. We're acting without words. So even mouthing what you're saying is definitely a no-no. Don't make noise. Don't use props. And I try to remind them not to include violence or weapons